The iron door closed with a sound like a coffin lid. In the corridor beyond, gas lamps flickered against walls that wept with condensation, and somewhere in the depths of the building, a woman's voice rose in a hymn that had no melody. The attendant's keys jangled as he walked away, his boots echoing against stone worn smooth by decades of pacing feet. The new patient stood in the reception hall, still wearing the dress she had worn to breakfast that morning, still smelling of lavender water and the parlour she would never see again. Her husband had signed the papers in the physician's office while she waited in the carriage. The physician had asked her 3 questions. She had answered all of them incorrectly, though she did not know this yet. Now she stood in a room where the ceiling was too high and the windows too narrow, where the air tasted of carbolic acid and something older, something that had soaked into the mortar between the bricks. A woman in a grey dress approached, her face neither kind nor cruel, merely efficient. She carried a bundle of coarse fabric. The patient's silk dress would be taken, her hair would be cut, her name would be written in a ledger, and beside it a single word in the physician's careful script. Outside, beyond the high walls and the iron gates, London continued its evening. Carriages rolled past, gaslights were being lit along the better streets, and in the asylum the new patient began to understand that morning had been a lifetime ago, and that this stone building with its narrow windows and its hymn-singing shadows was not a place one visited, but a place one became. Chapter 1: The Architecture of Forgetting. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world outside has grown still. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour finds you, know that you have arrived at a place of rest. Before sleep takes you, let us drift backward together through time, to an age when stone walls rose high and windows were built narrow, when the treatment of troubled minds became an industry, and when the word asylum meant both sanctuary and prison. If you have found comfort in these stories before, or if this is your first visit to this channel, consider pressing that subscribe button. It helps us continue bringing these forgotten chapters of history to your bedside. Tonight's journey will take us deep into Victorian England, into the world of the asylum, and I promise you, the story that unfolds is worth your time. Let us begin. In the year 1845, the British Parliament passed an act that would reshape the landscape of England. The Lunatics Act required every county to build and maintain an asylum for the reception of pauper lunatics. It was not a suggestion, it was law. Within 2 decades, vast institutions rose across the countryside, their silhouettes breaking the horizons of Lancashire and Yorkshire, Surrey and Kent. They were built in the Gothic style, with towers and turrets, with facades of red brick or grey stone, with windows that were tall but barred, beautiful but secure. The architects who designed them spoke of therapeutic environments, of buildings that would inspire calm and order in disordered minds. They positioned the asylums on high ground, away from the smoke and noise of the cities, surrounded by acres of farmland and gardens. Fresh air and distance from corruption, they believed, were essential to the cure of madness. The philosophy behind these buildings was called moral treatment. It had emerged in the late 18th century, pioneered by men like William Tuke, a Quaker merchant who founded the York Retreat in 1796. Tuke had been horrified by the conditions in traditional madhouses, where patients were chained in cellars, beaten, displayed for public amusement. He proposed something different. The insane, he argued, were not animals to be caged, but sick individuals who could be restored to reason through kindness, occupation, and a structured environment. Restraints should be minimized. Patients should work in gardens, participate in crafts, take regular meals at regular hours. The asylum should function like a family, with the superintendent as a benevolent father and the attendants as firm but compassionate guardians. It was a humane vision, and for a time in small institutions with wealthy patients and high ratios of staff to inmates, it produced remarkable results. But moral treatment was born in private retreats that housed 30 patients. The Victorian asylum system was built to house thousands. When the county asylums opened their doors in the 1850s, and 1860s, they were designed for populations of 200 or 300. By the 1880s, many held over 1,000. By the turn of the century, some held 2,000. The buildings grew and grew, sprawling complexes of wards and corridors, admin blocks and laundries, chapels and workshops connected by covered walkways and underground tunnels. They became self-contained worlds, miniature towns with their own gasworks and water supplies, their own bakeries and burial grounds. The architecture of moral treatment had been scaled up into something else entirely, into institutions so narrow that no superintendent could know every patient's name. No physician could spend more than a few minutes with each case. The asylums were built on a principle called the linear plan. Long corridors stretched the length of the buildings, with wards opening off each side. At one end were the amusement halls and workshops, the spaces for the hopeful and the improving. At the other end were the refractory wards, where the violent and the filthy were housed. The architecture itself was a map of prognosis. A patient admitted to the acute ward might, with treatment and fortune, move toward the social end of the building, toward the parlour where quiet patients took tea and read newspapers, or they might drift the other way, toward the back wards, the chronic wards, where the windows were smaller and the doors thicker and the air smelled of bodies and carbolic and despair. The building itself sorted hope from hopelessness. These asylums rose in places that are still named for them. Colney Hatch in Middlesex, later called Friern Hospital, opened in 1851 and became the largest asylum in Europe, a building with a facade 1/3 of a mile long. Hanwell Asylum in West London housed over 1,000 patients by the 1860s. Cane Hill in Surrey, Lancaster Moor, Prestwich in Manchester, Broadmoor in Berkshire for the criminally insane. They were landmarks, visible for miles, their clock towers and chapel spires marking the countryside like cathedrals of a new faith. The faith was in science, in medicine, in the perfectibility of human institutions. The Victorians believed that madness could be categorized, studied, treated, cured. They believed that the asylum, properly designed and managed, would empty itself as patients recovered and returned to their families. But the asylums did not empty. They filled and continued to fill year after year. In 1850, there were perhaps 7,000 certified lunatics in English asylums. By 1900, there were over 100,000. The reasons for this increase were many and tangled. Some were genuine, the result of better identification of mental illness, the inclusion of patients who previously would have been kept at home or left to wander. Some were social, the result of families and parishes using certification as a solution to burdensome relatives, difficult wives, aging parents who had become strange or troublesome. Some were medical, the long-term effects of syphilis and alcoholism producing madness in middle age. The survival of children with developmental disorders who in earlier times would not have lived to adulthood. And some were institutional, the simple fact that once a vast system exists to receive and house the insane, it tends to find more and more people who fit the category. The asylums became permanent. What had been designed as hospitals became holding facilities. The average length of stay grew longer. Patients who arrived in their 20s remained in their 40s, their 60s, their 80s. The wards that had been meant for acute cases filled with chronic ones. The workshops that were meant to occupy recovering patients became necessary labour to keep the institution running, to feed and clothe and clean for a population that never left. The asylum had been built as a place of cure, but it became a place of containment. The architecture remained the same, the long corridors and the chapel bells and the gardens where patients walked in supervised groups, but the purpose had quietly shifted, from treatment to custody, from hope to management. The physicians who ran these institutions were called medical superintendents, and they were men of standing in their communities. They lived in houses on the asylum grounds, large residences with gardens, separate from the wards but connected by private pathways. They made rounds each morning visiting the wards, reviewing cases, signing orders for restraint or seclusion or transfer. They wrote annual reports to the commissioners in lunacy, the government body that oversaw the asylum system, reports filled with statistics on admissions and discharges, recoveries and deaths, assaults and escapes. They attended conferences, published papers in the Journal of Mental Science, debated theories of heredity and degeneration. Many were conscientious men who believed in their work and were distressed by the overcrowding and understaffing that made true moral treatment impossible. But they were also men of their time, influenced by theories that saw madness as a taint in the blood, a weakness of character, a failure of self-control. They believed that some patients could be cured, but they also believed that many could not, that certain forms of insanity were incurable by nature, and that the best the asylum could offer such patients was humane containment. The asylum grounds were extensive, often 100 acres or more. There were farms where male patients worked, planting and harvesting under the supervision of attendants who were also farmers. There were laundries where female patients scrubbed and ironed, kitchens where they peeled vegetables, sewing rooms where they mended the institution's endless supply of linens and straitjackets. There were airing courts, walled yards where patients could walk in circles, taking exercise without the possibility of escape. There were chapels where services were held on Sundays, the patients sitting in pews arranged by classification, the quiet and the clean at the front, the noisy and the dirty at the back. There were cemeteries, often tucked away in a corner of the grounds, where those who died unclaimed were buried in numbered graves, their names recorded in ledgers but not on stones. The asylum was designed to be self-sufficient, a world apart from the world beyond its walls. And for the patients who entered, it often became the only world they would know for the rest of their lives. The architecture of forgetting was not metaphorical. These buildings were placed at the edges of towns, hidden behind trees and high walls, out of sight of the respectable neighbourhoods. The patients inside were removed from the census of normal society, their existences recorded only in asylum registers and medical case notes. Families sometimes told neighbours that a daughter had gone to live with relatives in the country, that a son had taken work abroad. The asylum made forgetting easy, made it possible to sign the papers and turn away and let the institution absorb the difficult, the strange, the inconvenient. And yet the buildings themselves were not forgotten. They stood solid and permanent, employing hundreds of staff, consuming thousands of pounds in annual budgets, shaping the landscape and the economy of the regions where they were built. They were part of the Victorian project, the great machinery of progress and control, the systems that organised society into categories and institutions that measured and classified and managed every aspect of human life from cradle to grave. The asylum was one piece of that machinery, alongside the workhouse and the prison and the hospital, each with its own architecture, its own rules, its own population of those who did not fit the pattern of respectable Victorian life. The light is fading now, and the corridors of those buildings grow long in memory. In the chapters ahead, we will walk those corridors, enter those wards, witness the process by which a person became a patient and a patient became a number in a ledger. We will meet the physicians and the attendants, the paupers and the private patients, the violent and the melancholic and the merely inconvenient. We will see the treatments applied in the name of science, the restraints and the baths and the drugs. We will hear the testimony of those who survived to tell what happened behind the high walls and the narrow windows. The asylum system lasted for more than a century, and its shadow is long, but for now, rest. The chapter closes here, and the next waits just beyond. Chapter 2. The Admission. The process of commitment began with a signature. In Victorian England, 2 signatures to be precise. The Lunacy Act of 1890 required that a person could only be detained in an asylum if 2 medical practitioners had examined them and certified them as insane. The law was designed as a safeguard, protection against wrongful confinement. But in practice, the examination often lasted minutes, and the questions asked were few and formulaic. The physicians who performed these certifications were general practitioners, paid a fee for each case, and they rarely knew the patient before the examination. They asked about sleep, about appetite, about strange beliefs or behaviours. They observed manner and speech. They read statements provided by family members. Then they signed the certificates, and the machinery of admission began to turn. For pauper lunatics, those without means to pay for private care, the process began at the workhouse or the police station. A woman found wandering the streets at night, speaking to people who were not there, would be taken to the workhouse infirmary. A man who threatened his neighbours, who believed his food was poisoned, who sat in his room for days without speaking, would be brought before the magistrate. The relieving officer, the official responsible for poor relief in each parish, would arrange for the medical examination. 2 doctors would attend, usually the workhouse medical officer and a local practitioner. The examination might take place in a bare room, with the patient brought in and questioned while standing. The doctors noted responses in their certificates, phrases that appeared again and again in the records, delusions of persecution, incoherent speech, refusal to answer questions, violent tendencies. Each certificate required a statement of facts, observations that supposedly indicated insanity, but the facts were often sparse and subjective. She believes her neighbours are plotting against her. He claims to be receiving messages from God. She refuses to eat, saying the food is poisoned. He struck his wife without provocation. Once the certificates were signed, the order for admission was prepared. For paupers, this order came from the Justice of the Peace, the local magistrate. It authorised the patient's removal to the county asylum and their detention there until discharged by the medical superintendent. The patient had no say in this process, no right to appeal before admission. They were informed they were going to the asylum, often on the same day the order was signed. Sometimes they went willingly, believing they were going to a hospital where they would receive treatment. Sometimes they resisted and had to be restrained and transported in a locked carriage. The journey to the asylum might be short or long depending on where the patient lived and where the nearest county asylum stood. In rural counties, it could be hours by rail and then cart, the patient accompanied by an attendant or a constable, passing through landscapes they might never see again. For private patients, those with families who could afford to pay, the process was similar in law but different in practice. The examination still required 2 medical certificates, but it often took place in the patient's home with family physicians who had known the patient for years. The conversation was more genteel, the questioning more careful. A daughter who had become withdrawn and melancholic after a disappointment in love, who spoke of ending her life, who refused to leave her room. A wife who had become convinced her husband was unfaithful, who accused him constantly, who had taken to wandering the house at night with a kitchen knife. A son who had shown promise at university but returned home speaking of grand schemes and spending money wildly, who did not sleep, who alternated between euphoria and rage. The physician spoke with the family, learned the history, observed the patient's behaviour and responses, then they signed the certificates, and the family made arrangements. Private patients went to private asylums, smaller establishments that catered to the middle and upper classes, or to the private wards of the larger county asylums, where for a weekly fee they could have better rooms, better food, more privacy. The admission was managed discreetly. A carriage would arrive and the patient would be told they were going to a rest cure in the country, to a nursing home where they could recover from nervous exhaustion. Often they believed this, at least until they arrived and saw the bars on the windows, the locks on the doors, the attendants who would not let them leave. Some patients understood immediately that they had been deceived. Others took days or weeks to realise that this was not a temporary arrangement, that their families had committed them, that the physicians had decided they required indefinite detention. The moment of admission was a threshold. On one side was the world of names and relationships, of homes and possessions, of autonomy and personhood. On the other side was the world of the asylum, where a person became a patient, a case, a number in the admissions register. The asylum clerk recorded the details in a large leather-bound book: name, age, occupation, marital status, religion, previous attacks of insanity if any, duration of present attack, supposed cause. The causes written in these registers were often vague and telling: domestic trouble, disappointment in love, business losses, childbirth, intemperance, religious excitement, hereditary predisposition, causes that said as much about Victorian society as they did about the individual patient. A woman's admission might be attributed to the change of life, meaning menopause, or to puerperal insanity, madness following childbirth. A man's might be attributed to overwork, or to self-abuse, the Victorian euphemism for masturbation, which was believed to cause insanity if practiced excessively. A young person's might be attributed to brain fever, a catch-all term for any acute mental disturbance. The question of who truly belonged in an asylum troubled the Victorians themselves. There were cases that seemed clear, the violent and destructive, the completely incoherent, the suicidal. But there were many cases that occupied a grey area. People who were difficult or eccentric or troublesome but not obviously mad. Wives who defied their husbands too openly. Daughters who refused to marry the men chosen for them. Sons who showed no interest in the family business. Elderly relatives who had become querulous and demanding. The asylum could be, and sometimes was, used as a solution to family problems that were not primarily medical. The law tried to prevent this, requiring medical certification rather than allowing families to commit relatives at will. But the medical profession of the time had broad definitions of insanity that could encompass behaviours we would now see as eccentric or rebellious rather than ill. There were famous cases of wrongful confinement that scandalised Victorian society. Louisa Nottage, confined by her brothers in 1846 because she had joined a religious community they disapproved of and refused to leave it. Rosina Bulwer-Lytton, wife of the novelist Edward Bulwer-Lytton, confined by her husband in 1858 after she publicly denounced him, released only after press attention made her continued detention untenable. Georgina Weldon, who fought a long legal battle after her husband attempted to have her certified in 1878, and who afterward became a campaigner for reform of the lunacy laws. These cases revealed how easily the certification process could be manipulated, how two physicians could be found who had signed certificates based on hearsay and family testimony rather than thorough examination. But for every famous case of wrongful confinement, there were thousands of obscure ones. Pauper patients with no families to advocate for them, no resources to challenge their detention. A woman certified as insane because she had borne a child out of wedlock and afterward became withdrawn and refused to speak. A man certified because he had become convinced after years of unemployment that society had conspired against him. A teenager certified because of violent outbursts that might today be recognised as epilepsy or a developmental disorder. Once certified and admitted, these patients had little recourse. They could write letters, but the letters were read by asylum staff and might not be sent if deemed inappropriate. They could petition the commissioners in lunacy, the inspectors who visited asylums regularly, but the commissioners usually deferred to the medical superintendent's judgment. They could ask to see the magistrate when he made his quarterly visit, but the magistrate's role was to ensure the asylum was following proper procedures, not to second-guess medical decisions about who should be detained. The asylum received all kinds. The violent and the catatonic, the melancholic and the manic, the demented and the epileptic, the genuinely psychotic and the merely inconvenient. It received men and women, young and old, though women outnumbered men in most asylums, a disparity that reflected both genuine differences in rates of certain disorders and the greater likelihood that families would seek to confine difficult women. It received people from all classes, though paupers vastly outnumbered private patients. It received those suffering from syphilis in its final stages, their minds destroyed by the spirochete that had gone untreated for years or decades. It received chronic alcoholics, their brains damaged by drink. It received women who had attempted suicide after the death of a child. Men who had suffered breakdowns after business failures, young people whose strange behaviours and beliefs had frightened their families beyond endurance. And it received some who were not insane at all, not by any reasonable definition, but who had nowhere else to go. The elderly with dementia who needed care but not necessarily in an asylum. People with intellectual disabilities called idiots or imbeciles in the language of the time, who were harmless but could not live independently. Epileptics, whose seizures frightened families and neighbours, though epilepsy was not a form of madness. The asylum became a repository for all kinds of human difficulty, all the problems that Victorian society did not know how to solve or did not wish to accommodate in the ordinary flow of life. The admission hall where patients first arrived often tried to maintain an illusion of normality, of welcome even. Clean floors, decent furniture, prints on the walls, but the staff who received them knew this was the easy part. The calm before the real business began. In the rooms beyond, the patient would be stripped, bathed, examined, classified, and assigned to a ward. The asylum had accepted them through its doors, and now the institution would remake them in its own image. The person who had arrived with a name and a history would become a case study, a file of symptoms and treatments, a body to be managed within the daily routine of the wards. The certificates were filed away in the superintendent's office, the legal documents that justified every day of the patient's confinement. And the patient, now admitted, passed beyond the reception hall into the world of the asylum proper, into corridors and wards they would come to know better than any place they had lived before. The admission was complete. What came next was transformation. Chapter 3. The Stripping Away. The bath hall was the first room beyond the admission corridor. It was tiled in white or pale green, with high windows that let in light but revealed nothing of the grounds beyond. In the centre stood several baths, deep cast-iron tubs with taps for hot and cold water. Along the walls were benches where patients sat while they waited, and cabinets where soap and towels were kept locked away. The attendants who worked here had done this many times, and they moved with practised efficiency. The new patient was brought in, still accompanied by whoever had escorted them from the reception hall, and told to undress. For many, this was the moment when the reality of the asylum first truly struck. To be ordered to remove one's clothing by strangers, in a cold institutional room, with no privacy and no choice, was a violation that went beyond the physical. Victorian society placed enormous emphasis on modesty, on the concealment of the body, on the propriety of dress and comportment. Women wore layers of undergarments and never appeared in public without being fully covered from neck to ankle. Men maintained strict boundaries around physical exposure. To be stripped, to stand naked under the gaze of attendants who showed neither interest nor sympathy, was to be reduced from person to body, from individual to specimen. Some patients complied quietly, understanding that resistance would achieve nothing. They unbuttoned and unlaced with trembling fingers, removed each layer and handed it to the attendant who waited with arms outstretched. Others refused, clutched their clothing, backed into corners, had to be held by multiple attendants while their garments were removed by force. The asylum's records rarely mention these scenes, but they happen daily. A woman who'd worn silk and lace found herself being pulled from her dress by hands that were not gentle. A man who had worn a suit tailored on Savile Row stood shivering while his shirt was taken and his trousers pulled down. The body, unclothed, was the first property the asylum took. The clothing was examined and then taken away. Anything valuable was noted in the patient's property book, a ledger where belongings were recorded in case of eventual discharge or death. Jewellery was removed, watches, coins, anything that could be sold or used as a weapon. The clothing itself was bundled and stored if the patient was private and expected to be discharged eventually. For pauper patients, personal clothing was often kept only briefly, then discarded or distributed to other patients if it was in good condition. The asylum could not store thousands of sets of clothes indefinitely. Within days, the dress or suit a person had worn on admission would be gone, given away or burned, and with it went another link to the life outside. After the stripping came the bath. The attendants filled the tub and tested the temperature, lukewarm usually, neither hot nor cold. The patient was told to get in or was lifted and placed in if they resisted. The water rose around them, chest deep, and the attendants began to wash them with coarse soap and rough cloths. Hair was scrubbed, sometimes cut if it was matted or infested with lice. Bodies were washed thoroughly, no part exempted, no modesty permitted. The attendants were looking for marks, bruises, scars, signs of disease or injury. They noted anything unusual in their reports: old fractures, syphilitic lesions, evidence of self-harm. The body in the bath was examined as one might examine a horse brought to market, assessed for what it revealed about history and condition. For women, the examination often extended further. Female attendants checked for pregnancy, for signs of venereal disease, for evidence of recent childbirth. Many women were admitted in the weeks or months following delivery, suffering from puerperal insanity, and the asylum needed to know if they required medical attention beyond psychiatric care. The examination was intimate and invasive, conducted without anaesthetic or ceremony. The patient lay on a table in a side room, while the attendant or the asylum's medical officer conducted the inspection. What was found was recorded in the case notes, details of menstruation and reproductive history that became part of the permanent record. After the bath and examination came the clothing of the asylum. For pauper patients, this meant institutional dress, garments made in the asylum's own sewing rooms from coarse fabric in drab colours. Women received shifts and dresses of brown or grey linen, thick stockings, heavy boots. Men received shirts and trousers of the same rough material, waistcoats without buttons, boots without laces. Everything was designed to be durable and difficult to use for self-harm or violence. There were no belts, no ties, no long ribbons or cords. The clothing was shapeless and identical, making it impossible to distinguish one patient from another by dress. In the wards, everyone looked the same, an intentional erasure of individual identity. Private patients fared somewhat better. They were allowed to wear their own clothing if it was deemed appropriate, though anything with potential for danger was removed. Corset stays that could be pulled out and sharpened, hat pins, cufflinks, collar studs. Women's dresses were examined and sometimes altered, long ribbons cut short, decorative buttons replaced with cloth fastenings. Men's suits were permitted, but watches and chains were taken away. Even in the private wards, the asylum imposed its rules on dress. No one wore black as it was thought to encourage melancholy. No one wore bright red as it was thought to excite mania. The institution dictated not just behaviour but appearance, shaping the patient's presentation to fit the asylum's theories of what promoted mental health. Hair was often cut, especially for women. Long hair was considered a nuisance in the asylum, difficult to keep clean and tidy, prone to harbour lice, easily pulled in fights between patients. The matron or an attendant would sit the new patient on a stool and cut, sometimes short, sometimes brutally short, letting the hair fall to the floor in dark or fair heaps that would be swept up and burned. For Victorian women, hair was a crucial marker of femininity and respectability. To lose it was a humiliation that some patients never recovered from. They touched their shorn heads constantly in the first days, disbelieving war. Mourning the loss as one might mourn the death of something beloved. After the clothing came the classification. The medical superintendent or one of the assistant medical officers examined the patient, asked questions, reviewed the admission certificates and the attendance reports from the bath hall. They made notes on physical condition, on manner and speech, on the nature of the delusions or disturbances that had led to admission. Then they assigned the patient to a ward. This decision was crucial as it determined almost everything about the patient's experience in the asylum. The chronic wards, the acute wards, the refractory wards, the epileptic wards, the infirm wards. Each had different routines, different levels of supervision, different populations. A patient sent to a refractory ward, where the violent and uncontrollable were housed, might be subjected to constant restraint and have no access to the asylum's workshops or grounds. A patient sent to an acute ward might have a bed in a dormitory with 20 others, but also have the chance to attend occupational activities and eventually move to a convalescent ward if they improved. The classification was supposed to be based on medical judgment, on the diagnosis and prognosis the physician made after examining the patient. But in overcrowded asylums, it was often based on simpler criteria. Is this patient violent? Is this patient dirty? Is this patient noisy? Can this patient work? The answers to these questions determined placement more reliably than any diagnostic category. A quiet melancholic might be sent to a better ward than a diagnosis alone would warrant, simply because they would not cause trouble. A manic patient might be sent to the refractory ward not because their condition was incurable, but because the asylum had nowhere else to put someone who could not sit still and be quiet. With classification came the assignment of a case number. The patient was no longer Mary Smith or John Brown, but case 1247 or case 2198, a number written on their medical record and on a band sometimes tied to their wrist. In the wards, attendants used names if they remembered them, but in the paperwork and the official reports, patients were numbers, data points in the statistics the superintendent compiled for the commissioners. The transformation from person to case was administrative as well as physical, a matter of ledgers and files as much as baths and institutional clothing. Possessions were taken to the storeroom, a locked space where the property books were kept. Gold rings and silver bracelets, pocket watches and silk handkerchiefs, photographs in leather frames, letters tied with ribbon. Everything was catalogued and stored, waiting for a discharge that might never come. In the case of death, these items would be sent to the family if family could be found, or sold to cover the cost of burial if not. In the case of permanent residents, they simply accumulated boxes and bags of personal effects gathering dusties while their owners grew old in the wards, sometimes forgetting they had ever owned such things. The patient who had arrived at the asylum hours earlier no longer existed in any recognisable form. The dress or suit they had worn was gone. Their hair was cut. Their body had been examined in intimate detail and found to be the property of the institution. They wore clothing identical to dozens of other patients. They had been given a number and assigned to a ward. They stood in a corridor, often alone, while an attendant finished the paperwork, and they understood that everything familiar had been stripped away. Some wept, some raged, some stood in silence, shock written across their features like a language only they could read. An attendant would come eventually to escort them to the ward. Down corridors that all looked the same, past doors that were locked and unlocked with keys the attendant carried on a ring at their belt. Upstairs or down, depending on the ward, into the noise or silence of the place that would now be home. The stripping away was complete. What remained was the work of learning how to survive in the world the asylum made. A world with its own rules and hierarchies, its own dangers and small mercies. The door to the ward opened. The attendant guided the patient inside, and the door closed behind them with the sound that would become the most familiar sound in their life, the heavy mechanical click of a lock sliding into place. Chapter 4. The Daily Round. The bell woke them before dawn. It rang in the corridors, a harsh clanging that echoed off tile and plaster, and in the dormitories the patients stirred in their beds. The attendants moved down the rows, pulling back blankets, calling out to those who did not rise immediately. There was no gentleness in this waking. The asylum day began at 6 in summer, 6:30 in winter, and it began the same way every morning regardless of how the patients had slept, regardless of what disturbances had kept the wards awake during the night. The bell rang and the patients rose because there was no alternative, because to refuse was to invite punishment, to be marked as troublesome, to lose what few privileges the asylum granted. They dressed in the half-light, pulling on the same garments they had worn yesterday and would wear tomorrow, the institutional clothing that smelled of carbolic and stale sweat. There were no wardrobes, no private spaces. Clothing was kept in a locked cupboard and distributed each morning by the attendants, who matched patients to garments by size and made sure nothing was missing or damaged. Those who could dress themselves did so standing by their beds in the crowded dormitory. Sometimes 30 or 40 patients in a room, no privacy, no quiet. Those who could not dress themselves were dressed by attendants, their arms forced into sleeves, their buttons fastened, their boots pulled on, with the rough efficiency of handlers managing livestock. After dressing came the washing. In a room adjacent to the dormitory, there were basins lined up along the walls, cold water taps above them, coarse soap in dishes. The patients filed in and washed their faces and hands, using the same sliver of soap, drying on rough towels that were shared among them. There were no mirrors. The asylum did not permit them, fearing they might be broken and used as weapons. The patients washed blind, unable to see themselves, and in time, Many stopped caring what they looked like, stopped trying to maintain the habits of grooming that had once been automatic. Why care about one's appearance when one was always dressed in asylum brown, when one's hair was cut without art, when no one who mattered would see you? Breakfast followed. The patients were lined up in the corridor and marched to the dining hall, a large room with long tables and benches. The meals in the asylum were institutional in every sense, designed to be cheap and filling rather than pleasant. Breakfast was usually porridge or bread, sometimes both, with tea that tasted of tin and sugar that was rationed. The food was served from large pots by patients assigned to kitchen duty, ladled into tin bowls and plates that the other patients carried to the tables. They ate in silence or in the low murmur of conversation the attendants permitted, using spoons only, no knives or forks. The asylum could not trust its patients with sharp implements. Even the spoons were counted before and after each meal to make sure none had been taken and hidden. The food was monotonous. Porridge for breakfast, bread and cheese for dinner at midday, potatoes and meat for supper in the evening, though the meat was often gristle and fat, the cheapest cuts boiled until they fell apart. Vegetables came from the asylum farm when they were in season. Turnips and cabbage and carrots boiled until they lost all colour and texture. The asylum grew much of its own food, employing patients to work the land. And this made the institution largely self-sufficient, but it also meant that variety was limited to what could be grown or raised cheaply. There was milk sometimes, from the asylum's own cows. There was butter occasionally, though more often the bread was eaten dry. There was never enough of anything that tasted good. Patients hoarded crusts and scraps, hiding them in their clothing to eat later, when hunger struck between the rigid meal times. After breakfast, the day's work began. The asylum ran on patient labour. In the moral treatment philosophy, work was supposed to be therapeutic, a way to occupy troubled minds and give patients a sense of purpose. In practice, work was necessary to keep the institution functioning. The asylum could not afford to hire enough staff to do all the labour required, so patients did it. Male patients worked on the farm, planting and harvesting, tending animals, repairing fences. They worked in the workshops, making shoes and brushes and mending furniture. They worked in the grounds, cutting grass and trimming hedges and sweeping paths. Female patients worked in the laundries, scrubbing sheets and clothing in vast tubs of hot water, wringing them through mangles, hanging them to dry in steamy rooms. They worked in the sewing rooms, making and repairing the asylum's endless supply of institutional clothing and linens. They worked in the kitchens, peeling vegetables, washing dishes, scrubbing floors. The work was hard and it was unpaid. Patients received no wages, no compensation beyond their keep. The asylum justified this by saying the work was part of their treatment, that it helped them maintain skills and routines that would be useful if they were ever discharged. But the reality was that the institution depended on this labour to survive. Without patients working 10 or 12 hours a day in the laundries and the kitchens and fields, the asylum would have had to employ dozens more staff and would have gone bankrupt. Those patients were both inmates and unpaid workforce, their labour extracted in the name of therapy. Not all patients worked. Those deemed too disturbed or too weak were excused from labour and spent their days in the day rooms, large echoing spaces with benches along the walls and nothing much to do. They sat and stared or paced endlessly, walked back and forth across the room in patterns that became grooves in the floorboards over the years. Some rocked in place, some muttered to themselves, some simply sat in silence for hours, waiting for nothing in particular. The day rooms were where the chronic patients ended up, those for whom no improvement was expected. And the atmosphere was one of profound boredom, time passing with excruciating slowness. An hour could feel like a day could feel like a week. The clocks on the walls ticked but meant nothing because every day was the same and time had ceased to be a measure of progress toward anything. For those who did work, there were small privileges, access to the better airing courts, where there were trees and flower beds rather than just bare gravel, better food occasionally, an extra piece of bread or a bit of butter, permission to attend the evening entertainments, concerts or lectures that were held once a month in the asylum's amusement hall. The hierarchy in the asylum was clear. The working patients were more valuable than the idle ones, and there they were treated accordingly. They were allowed more freedom of movement, more interaction with attendants and staff, more access to the small comforts the institution could provide. The chronic patients in the back wards, those who could not work and would never improve, had none of these things. They existed at the bottom of the asylum's social order, cared for in the most minimal sense, kept alive but nothing more. Dinner was at noon, the same routine as breakfast, the march to the dining hall, the ladling of food, the silent consumption at long tables. Then back to work or back to the day rooms until supper at 6. The evenings were slightly less regimented. In some wards there were activities, organised by attendants who took an interest or by visiting volunteers. Simple games, card playing with packs that had no face cards, singing if there was someone who could lead it. In other wards, there was nothing, just the slow drift towards bedtime, patients sitting or pacing while the light faded and the gas lamps were lit. At 8 o'clock the bell rang again for bed. The patients filed back to the dormitories undressed under the eyes of the attendants and climbed into their narrow iron beds. The mattresses were thin, stuffed with horsehair or straw, and the blankets were rough wool that itched and never seemed warm enough. The patients lay in rows, close enough to hear each other breathing, close enough to hear every snore and cry and whispered prayer. The attendants extinguished most of the lamps, leaving only a single low flame in each dormitory so they could see to patrol during the night. Then they left, locking the dormitory door behind them. If a patient needed to relieve themselves during the night, there were chamber pots under the beds, but no privacy for using them. The smell in the dormitories by morning was often overwhelming, especially in the wards housing the incontinent and the demented. Sleep did not come easily in the asylum. The beds were uncomfortable, the rooms too hot or too cold depending on season, the darkness filled with the sounds of other patients. Some cried in their sleep, some screamed, some rose and tried to walk only to be returned to bed by the attendant on night duty. The night attendant sat in the corridor, dozing sometimes, checking the dormitories every hour or so, making sure no one had escaped or died or become violent. It was the loneliest shift, the hours stretching long and dark, and the attendants who worked nights were often the least conscientious, the ones who had been relegated to the shift because they were incompetent or cruel or simply unwanted by the day staff. The patients who could not sleep lay and stared at the ceiling, or at the dim shapes of the other beds. They thought about the world outside, about the lives they had left behind, about the people who had signed the papers and sent them here. Some prayed, some wept quietly into their thin pillows, some retreated into their delusions, the interior worlds that were more bearable than the reality of the ward, and some simply endured hour after hour, waiting for the bell that would ring at dawn and begin the cycle again. The daily round was unvarying. 6 days a week it was the same: wake, wash, eat, work, sleep. On Sundays there was the chapel in the morning. The patients marched in their classifications to sit through a service conducted by a visiting clergyman who rarely looked at them directly. Then the afternoon was free, though free meant only that there was no work, not that there was anything else to do. The patients sat in the day rooms or walked in the airing courts if the weather permitted, and the hours passed as slowly as they did every other day. This was life in the asylum, not the dramatic scenes of violence or breakthrough that might appear in later stories, but the grinding monotony of institutional routine day after day, week after week, year after year. The asylum measured time not in progress toward recovery, but in tasks completed, meals consumed, hours endured. For the patients who had been there for decades, who would die there eventually, the daily round was all there was. It had replaced every other rhythm of life, every other pattern of days. They no longer remembered what it was like to wake without a bell, to eat when hungry rather than when fed, to work at tasks they had chosen, to sleep in darkness that was private and silent. The institution had consumed them as it consumed everyone who stayed long enough. The daily round ground individuality away, reduced personality to behaviour that could be managed or could not. And through it all, the asylum functioned, self-sufficient and eternal, a machine that ran on human suffering and called it treatment. Chapter 5. The Treatments. The treatment room stood at the end of a corridor that patients learned to dread. It was a space apart from the dormitories and day rooms, marked by a heavy door with a small observation window and a lock that was always fastened. Inside, the room was stark and clinical, with tiled walls that could be easily cleaned, a few pieces of specialized equipment, and cabinets containing the medicines and implements the asylum physicians employed in their efforts to cure madness. The treatments administered here were guided by the medical theories of the Victorian age, theories that saw insanity as a physical disorder of the brain that could be corrected through physical means. The mind, the Victorians believed, was not separate from the body but emerged from it, and therefore disorders of thought and behaviour must have their origins in disordered flesh, in overheated blood or inflamed nerves or chemical imbalances that could be addressed through intervention. The cold bath was among the oldest and most frequently used treatments. It derived from the principle that shock to the system could interrupt the patterns of disordered thinking, that sudden immersion in cold water would redirect the vital forces and calm an agitated mind. The bath used for this purpose was deeper than those in the bath hall, where patients were washed on admission. It was a plunge bath, deep enough that a patient could be submerged almost completely, cold enough to make the body gasp and the heart race. Patients selected for cold bath treatment were brought to the treatment room by attendants and told to undress. Then they were lowered into the water, which was kept at temperatures that hovered just above freezing, cold enough to be profoundly uncomfortable but not quite cold enough to cause immediate harm. The treatment could last minutes or hours, depending on the physician's orders and the patient's response. A patient might be held in the bath for 15 minutes while attendants ensured they did not climb out, or they might be kept there for an hour, their skin turning pale and their lips blue, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. The physicians believed that the longer the immersion, the more therapeutic the effect, that the cold would penetrate deep into the tissues and calm the inflamed nerves that caused mania or melancholia. Some patients emerged from cold bath treatment quiet and subdued, too exhausted and chilled to do anything but huddle in blankets and sleep. Others emerged more agitated than before, their bodies shocked into a state of panic that took hours to subside. The treatment was recorded in the case notes with clinical detachment. Cold bath administered, duration 60 minutes, patient quieter afterward. There was also the warm bath, but this was different in purpose and effect. The warm bath was a continuous bath, a treatment that involved keeping a patient immersed in lukewarm water for days or even weeks at a time. The bath was large, almost like a small pool, and the patient was placed in it and covered with a canvas sheet that had a hole for the head, so that only the face remained above water. The water was kept at body temperature, neither hot nor cold, and the patient remained in this state for hours each day, sometimes for entire days and nights, tended by staff who changed the water periodically and ensured the patient did not drown. The theory was that the continuous immersion would have a soothing effect, that the warmth and the enforced stillness would calm agitated patients and help melancholic patients relax the tension that gripped their bodies and minds. In practice, the continuous bath was both treatment and restraint. A patient in the bath could not move, could not pace or strike out or tear at their clothing. They were held in place by the water and the canvas, floating in enforced idleness while hours passed. Some found it genuinely calming, the warmth and the stillness a relief from the chaos of their thoughts. Others found it maddening, the inability to move or dry off or escape from the sensation of being waterlogged. Their skin would wrinkle and soften, their fingers and toes turning white and pruned. They would call out to be released, and the attendants would ignore them, following the physician's orders that the bath must continue for the prescribed duration. The continuous bath could last days, the patient lifted out only briefly for meals and to use a bedpan, then returned to the water until the treatment period was complete. Restraint was a treatment in itself, though the Victorians were reluctant to call it that. Moral treatment had promised to eliminate mechanical restraints, to manage patients through kindness and occupation rather than through chains and straitjackets. But in the overcrowded county asylums of the late Victorian period, restraint remained common, a practical necessity in wards where dozens of patients were supervised by 2 or 3 attendants. The straitjacket was the most recognisable form of restraint, a canvas garment with long sleeves that could be tied behind the patient's back, preventing them from using their arms. A patient who was violent, who struck attendants or other patients, would be wrestled into a straitjacket and left in it for hours or days until they had calmed. A patient who tore at their clothing or their own skin would be jacketed to prevent self-harm. The straitjacket was hot and uncomfortable, and being confined in one was an experience of profound helplessness. The patient could not feed themselves, could not scratch an itch, could not wipe their face if they wept. They were dependent on the attendants for everything, and the attendants were often too busy or too indifferent to provide much assistance. Patients in straitjackets were sometimes left sitting on benches in the corridors for entire shifts, visible to everyone who passed, a warning to other patients about what would happen if they misbehaved. The jackets were supposed to be temporary, but in practice some patients wore them for weeks, their arms growing weak from disuse, their shoulders aching from the constant constraint. There were other forms of restraint as well, leather straps that fastened a patient's wrists and ankles to the bed frame, used for those who tried to leave their beds at night or who thrashed and kicked during episodes of mania. Canvas sleeves that enclosed the arms and fastened with buckles, similar to straitjackets but less restrictive. Muffs, padded tubes that enclosed the hands and prevented the fingers from grasping or scratching. The asylum had an entire closet of restraint devices, each designed for a specific purpose, each representing a failure of the moral treatment ideal. The physicians justified restraint by saying it protected patients from harming themselves or others, and this was sometimes true. But restraint was also used for convenience, to make difficult patients easier to manage, to reduce the labour required from understaffed wards. Seclusion was another treatment that blurred the line between therapy and punishment. The seclusion room was a small cell, usually padded with layers of canvas or cork to prevent patients from injuring themselves against the walls. It contained nothing but a mattress on the floor, no furniture, no windows except a small observation port in the door. A patient who was acutely disturbed, who screamed continuously or tried to harm themselves, would be placed in seclusion and the door locked. They would remain there for hours or days, alone with their thoughts and their distress, until the physician decided they had calmed enough to return to the ward. Food was passed through a slot in the door. A bedpan was provided and removed by attendants. Otherwise, the patient was left alone in silence and near darkness. The seclusion room was meant to provide a space where a disturbed patient could not cause harm, where they could exhaust themselves without injuring anyone. But the experience of seclusion was often traumatic in itself. The isolation, the silence, the inability to track time or know when release would come. Patients emerged from seclusion sometimes quieter, but often more disturbed than when they had entered, their fears and delusions intensified by hours of solitary confinement. The asylum's records describe seclusion in neutral terms. Patient placed in seclusion room due to violent behaviour, released after 48 hours, condition improved. But the human reality of those 48 hours was rarely recorded. The desperation and terror and gradual breakdown of mind left alone with itself in a padded cell. Medication was a treatment as well, though the Victorian asylum had few effective drugs. Opium and its derivatives were used to sedate agitated patients, administered in the form of laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. A spoonful of laudanum could calm a manic patient or help a melancholic patient sleep, and it was dispensed liberally in many asylums. But opium was addictive, and patients who received it regularly became dependent, their distress returning worse than before when the drug was withheld. Chloral hydrate, a sedative discovered in the 1860s, was also widely used, mixed with water and given to patients at bedtime to ensure they slept. It was effective but dangerous in large doses, and overdoses were not uncommon, sometimes accidental, sometimes the result of attendants administering doses carelessly. Bromide salts were prescribed for epileptic patients and for those whose behaviour was thought to result from excessive nervous excitement. The bromides were bitter and unpleasant, and they had to be taken daily for weeks or months to have any effect. They did reduce seizures in epileptic patients, but they also caused a range of side effects, including lethargy, confusion, and a characteristic rash. Patients on long-term bromide treatment often became slow and dulled, their responses sluggish, their thoughts clouded. The asylum physicians saw this as an acceptable trade-off, a reduction in the symptoms that made patients difficult to manage, even if it came at the cost of the patient's alertness and vitality. There were other substances used as well, remedies that seem bizarre or barbaric from a modern perspective, but were accepted practice in Victorian psychiatry. Croton oil, a powerful purgative, was administered to patients to purge what were believed to be toxins in the digestive system that contributed to madness. The treatment caused violent diarrhea and cramping, leaving patients weak and dehydrated. Tartar emetic, a compound of antimony, was used to induce vomiting for similar reasons, the belief being that emptying the stomach would relieve pressure on the brain. Patients were given doses that made them vomit repeatedly, and the treatment was repeated until the physician was satisfied. These purgative and emetic treatments were based on ancient humoral theories of medicine, the idea that illness resulted from imbalances that could be corrected by expelling excess fluids or substances from the body. Some asylums employed electrical treatment, though it was less common than other methods. Galvanism, the application of mild electrical currents to the body, was thought to stimulate the nerves and restore their proper function. Electrodes were placed on the patient's temples or wrists, and current was applied in brief pulses. The treatment caused muscle contractions and a tingling sensation that patients found deeply unpleasant. There was no evidence that it helped with mental illness, but it continued to be used because physicians believed in the theoretical justification, the idea that electricity could rebalance the nervous system. The asylum physicians kept detailed notes on the treatments they administered, recording in case files the dates and durations of baths, the use of restraints, the drugs prescribed and their dosages. They believed they were practicing scientific medicine, applying rational methods to the problem of insanity. They attended medical conferences and read journals and debated the relative merits of different approaches, but much of what they did was simply management, controlling patients through sedation and restraint and seclusion because the asylums were too crowded and too understaffed to offer anything more sophisticated. Treatment and custody overlapped until they were indistinguishable, both conducted in the same rooms by the same staff, with the same ultimate goal of keeping the asylum running smoothly. The patients who received these treatments had no choice in the matter. They were not consulted about what would be done to them, not asked for consent. The physician decided, and the attendants carried out the orders, and the patient endured. If a treatment made them worse, if the cold baths increased their agitation or the drugs made them sick or the restraints left them injured, there was no recourse, no appeal. The treatment continued as ordered until the physician decided to try something else or to give up entirely and consign the patient to the chronic wards where no treatment was attempted any longer. And through it all, the belief persisted that this was medicine, that these interventions were helping, that the asylum was fulfilling its purpose as a place of cure. The physicians wrote in their reports about treatments administered and their effects, and the commissioners who read those reports nodded and approved and allocated more funds. The machinery of the asylum kept turning, fed by the bodies of patients who had no voice in their own care, no power to refuse what was done to them in the name of science and healing. The treatment room door stayed locked except when it was needed, and it was needed often, day after day. As new patients arrived and old patients deteriorated, and the asylum's methods were applied with mechanical regularity to minds that remained, in the end, as mysterious and unreachable as they had been when the institution first opened its doors. Chapter 6. The Attendants. The attendants were the unseen machinery of the asylum, the men and women who did the daily work of managing the wards, who woke the patients and fed them and bathed them and locked them in at night. They were not physicians or nurses in the modern sense. Most had no medical training, no education in the care of the mentally ill. They were working-class men and women who took the job because it paid a wage, because it came with housing in the asylum's staff quarters, because it was steadier work than labouring in a factory or on a farm. The pay was poor, usually less than what a skilled tradesman might earn, but it was regular, and the asylum provided meals in a small room so the attendants could save most of what they made. They came from the towns near the asylums, from families that worked with their hands, and they stayed for years, sometimes for decades, because once you learnt the routines and the methods, it was not difficult work, just monotonous and occasionally unpleasant. The male attendants worked the male wards, and the female attendants worked the female wards. This separation was absolute, a matter of Victorian propriety as much as practical management. A male attendant would never enter a female ward except in the most extreme emergency, and even then, only accompanied by female staff. The female attendants were supervised by the matron, a senior woman who lived in the asylum and oversaw all the female staff, from the ward attendants to the women who worked in the laundries and kitchens. The male attendants were supervised by the head attendant, a man who reported directly to the medical superintendent and who was responsible for maintaining order in the male wards. The work began early. Attendants reported for the day shift at 6 in the morning just before the bell rang to wake the patients. There were usually 2 or 3 attendants assigned to each ward, depending on the size and the classification of patients housed there. The violent wards had more staff, the chronic wards had fewer. The attendants unlocked the dormitory doors and began the morning routine, getting patients out of bed, overseeing washing and dressing, marching them to the dining hall for breakfast. Then came the distribution of patients to their daily activities, escorting work parties to the laundries or the farm, supervising the day rooms where idle patients sat. The attendants checked patients throughout the day, making sure none had absconded, breaking up fights, cleaning up messes, administering medications as ordered by the physicians. It was physical work, repetitive and sometimes exhausting. Attendants lifted patients who could not walk, wrestled violent patients into restraints, scrubbed floors when patients soiled them, carried food trays and laundry baskets. They spent hours on their feet patrolling the wards watching for trouble. The asylum never slept completely, and neither did its staff. There was always a night shift, attendants who sat in the corridors through the dark hours, checking on patients, responding to disturbances. The night attendants were often the least experienced, the newest hires, because the senior staff claimed the day shifts. Night duty was lonely and dull, hours of sitting in dim corridors listening to the sounds of sleeping and not sleeping patients, waiting for something to happen or for the shift to end. The relationship between attendants and patients was complicated. In the best cases, attendants developed genuine care for the patients they supervised, learned their names and their histories, showed kindness in small ways that made the institution slightly more bearable. They brought extra food from the kitchens for patients who were always hungry. They spoke gently to frightened patients, reassured them when they were confused or distressed. They remembered birthdays and tried to make them special in some small way. A bit of cake saved from the staff dining room, a few minutes of individual attention. These attendants were valued by the patients, remembered in the testimonies of those who survived and were discharged, described as the one person who had shown them humanity in a place that otherwise treated them as objects to be managed. But in the worst cases, attendants were cruel. The asylum gave them power over vulnerable people, and some used that power to abuse. They struck patients who annoyed them, withheld food as punishment, humiliated patients in front of others. They forced patients into cold baths when it was not medically ordered, left patients in restraints longer than necessary, ignored calls for help from patients who were sick or injured. The cruelty was sometimes casual, a slap or a harsh word delivered without thought because the attendant was tired or frustrated. And sometimes it was deliberate, a pattern of errors that continued for months or years because no one stopped it. The asylum structure made abuse easy to hide. Attendants worked without close supervision most of the time. The physicians made rounds once or twice a day, but they moved quickly through the wards, asking attendants about the patients rather than speaking to patients directly. The commissioners visited periodically, but their inspections were announced in advance, and wards could be cleaned up and difficult patients could be sedated or locked away in seclusion before the inspectors arrived. Patients who tried to report abuse were rarely believed. They were, after all, certified insane, and their complaints were easily dismissed as delusions or exaggerations. The attendant's word was taken over the patient's, and the attendant knew this. Knew they could act with near impunity as long as they were not caught in the act by someone with authority. Some attendants drank. It was forbidden, but alcohol could be smuggled in, and the long dull hours of night duty were easier to endure with a flask hidden in one's pocket. Drunk attendants were dangerous, their judgment impaired, their tempers short. They made mistakes, gave wrong medications, failed to notice when patients were in distress. They fell asleep on duty, leaving wards unsupervised. Some of the worst incidents in asylum history occurred when drunk or sleeping attendants failed to prevent suicides or attacks that a sober, vigilant staff member might have stopped. The female attendants faced particular challenges. They were paid less than the male attendants, despite doing the same work. They were subject to stricter rules of conduct, expected to maintain standards of propriety that the male staff were not held to. The matron supervised them closely, more closely than the head attendant supervised the men, and infractions that might be overlooked in male staff could result in dismissal for women. A female attendant who was found alone with a male staff member in any context other than professional duty could be fired for moral impropriety. A female attendant who became pregnant out of wedlock would certainly be dismissed. The asylum demanded that its female staff be respectable, beyond reproach, even as it paid them wages that barely allowed them to survive. The attendants lived in the asylum's staff quarters, buildings on the grounds separate from the patient wards, but still within the institution's walls. Their rooms were small, barely furnished, often shared with another attendant. They took their meals in a staff dining room that served better food than the patients received, but was still institutional fare. They had little privacy and little time off. A day attendant might work from 6 in the morning until 8 at night, with only brief breaks for meals. The schedule was 6 days a week, with Sunday afternoons free after the morning chapel service. It was a life consumed by the asylum, waking within its walls, working within its walls, sleeping within its walls. Some attendants left after a few months, unable to bear the monotony and the bleakness. Others stayed for decades, becoming as institutionalized as the patients, unable to imagine life outside of the routines of the wards. There was a hierarchy among the attendants, a pecking order based on seniority, and on which wards one was assigned to. Attendants on the acute wards or the convalescent wards had higher status than those on the chronic or refractory wards. The acute wards were where patients might actually improve and be discharged, where the work felt more like nursing and less like warehousing. The chronic wards were where hope died, where patients who would never leave spent decades in the same room, and working there was considered the least desirable assignment. New attendants started on the chronic wards, and if they proved competent, they might be promoted to better wards after a year or two. If they were incompetent or troublesome, they stayed on the chronic wards, or were moved to night duty, or were eventually dismissed. The head attendant and the matron were figures of considerable authority within the asylum. They hired and fired the ward attendants, assigned duties, conducted inspections, disciplined staff who violated rules. They answered to the medical superintendent, but day to day they ran the wards. The superintendent might see each patient for a few minutes during rounds, but the head attendant and matron saw everything, knew which attendants were reliable and which were lazy, which patients were genuinely improving, and which were simply better at hiding their symptoms. Their knowledge was practical and detailed, built from years of observation, and the superintendent relied on them to maintain order and report problems. Training for attendants was minimal or non-existent in the early Victorian period. New hires learned by watching experienced attendants and imitating their methods. By the late 19th century, some asylums had begun to offer formal training programs, lectures on the care of the insane, instruction in basic medical procedures like taking a pulse or applying a bandage. The Medico-Psychological Association, the professional body for asylum physicians, published a handbook for attendants in 1885, outlining proper methods for managing patients, recognizing medical emergencies, and maintaining ward hygiene. But even with these efforts, most attendants learned primarily through experience, through years of repetition and trial and error, and the quality of care they provided depended largely on their individual character and conscience. Some attendants came to the work with idealism, a genuine desire to help the mentally ill. They'd read about moral treatment, about the possibility of curing madness through kindness and occupation, and they believed the asylum could be a place of healing. These attendants were often disappointed by the reality, by the overcrowding and the chronic cases, and the limitations of what could actually be achieved. But some maintained their idealism despite the conditions, continued to treat patients with dignity, advocated for better care when they could. These were the attendants whose names appeared in letters of gratitude from discharged patients, the ones remembered as having made a difference. Others came to the work with no particular feeling about it at all. It was a job, nothing more. They did what was required, followed the routines, stayed out of trouble. They were neither cruel nor especially kind, just indifferent, going through the motions for a wage. And this indifference was perhaps the most common attitude among asylum staff, the baseline that most attendants settled into after the initial months of adjustment. The patients became familiar, their behaviours predictable, the work routine. It was easier not to think too deeply about what the asylum was, what it did to the people inside it, easier to simply do the tasks assigned and collect the pay and go on with life. The attendants knew things the physicians did not, saw things that never appeared in the medical records. They knew which patients were genuinely dangerous and which were only frightening in appearance. They knew which treatments actually helped and which were merely theatre. They knew when a patient was pretending to be well in order to gain privileges, and when a patient was pretending to be worse in order to avoid work. They knew the small economies of the wards, how patients traded tobacco or food, who had influence over others, which alliances and enmities shaped daily life. This knowledge was rarely formalised or written down. It was passed from one attendant to another through conversation and example, a practical wisdom that kept the wards functioning, but that remained invisible to those who did not work inside them. The sound of keys was the sound of the attendants. Every attendant carried a ring of keys on their belt, keys to the dormitories and the day rooms and the storerooms and the gates. The keys jangled when they walked, a constant metallic music that announced their presence before they came into view. The patients learned to recognise individual attendants by the sound of their keys, by the particular rhythm of their walk. Some attendants were heavy-footed and slow, their approach giving patients time to prepare. Others moved quickly, their keys ringing sharply, and their arrival was sudden and could be startling. The keys were a symbol of the power differential, the fact that attendants could move freely while patients could not, that attendants controlled access to every space and every resource. When attendants left the asylum, either to retire or to seek work elsewhere, they often found it difficult to adjust to life outside. They had spent years in an environment where they had authority, where their word was law in the small domain of their ward, and the outside world did not offer that. They had become accustomed to the rhythms of institutional life, the bells and the routines, and ordinary work felt strange and unstructured by comparison. Some returned to asylum work after brief attempts at other employment, finding that they could not settle anywhere else. They had become, in their own way, as dependent on the institution as the patients were. The attendants were the asylum's foundation, the layer on which everything else rested. Without them, the physician's orders would not be carried out, the patients would not be fed or supervised, the institution would collapse, and yet they were paid poorly, housed poorly, given little respect by the medical staff who saw themselves as professionals and saw the attendants as mere labourers. The asylum could not function without them, but it treated them as expendable, easily replaced if they quit or were dismissed. This contradiction was never resolved, and it shaped the culture of the wards, created an atmosphere where carelessness and cruelty could flourish because the people doing the hardest work were the least valued and the least supervised. The light in the corridors was always dim, and the attendants moved through it like shadows, keys jangling, doing the work that kept the vast machinery of the asylum turning day after day, year after year, until they were too old or too tired to continue, and someone else took their keys and their place on the wards. Chapter 7. The Categories of Madness. The asylum physicians were men of science, or believed themselves to be. They had studied at medical schools, read the latest journals, attended conferences where theories of insanity were debated and refined. They approached madness as a problem to be understood through careful observation and classification, the same methods that had proven so successful in other branches of medicine. If consumption could be categorized and cholera studied, and typhoid fever traced to its source, then surely insanity too could be mapped and understood, its various forms distinguished and named. The Victorian Asylum was a laboratory in this sense, a place where thousands of disordered minds could be observed and recorded, where patterns could be sought in the chaos of human breakdown. The physicians created categories, diagnostic labels that appeared in medical textbooks and in the case notes written in asylum record rooms. These categories were meant to bring order to the bewildering variety of mental disturbance that arrived at the asylum gates, to allow physicians to group similar cases together and develop targeted treatments. But the categories were imperfect, based on observable symptoms rather than underlying causes, and many patients fit uneasily into the boxes the physicians created for them. Still, the system persisted because medicine required classification, and because the alternative was to admit that madness was too various and too mysterious to be captured in diagnostic schemes. Mania was one of the oldest and most recognizable categories. A patient in a state of mania was excited, energetic beyond normal human limits, unable to rest or be still. They talked rapidly, jumping from subject to subject with no coherent thread connecting their thoughts. They required little sleep, sometimes going for days without rest, their eyes bright and feverish, their bodies in constant motion. They made grandiose plans, believed themselves capable of extraordinary feats, saw no obstacles to their ambitions. A manic patient might declare themselves a great inventor and spend hours sketching impossible machines. They might believe they had discovered the secret of eternal life or had been chosen by God for a special mission. Their mood was elevated, euphoric even, but the euphoria was unstable, liable to tip into rage if they were contradicted or restrained. Mania was exhausting to witness and more exhausting to experience. The patients could not control themselves, could not slow the racing of their thoughts or calm the agitation that drove them. They wore themselves out, their bodies unable to sustain the manic energy indefinitely. And often a period of mania would end in complete collapse, the patient falling into a deep sleep that might last for days. When they woke, they were often confused, with little memory of what they had said or done during the manic episode. The asylum's treatment for mania was largely sedative, using cold baths and bromides and opiates to calm the patient until the episode burned itself out. Restraint was common, straitjackets and seclusion employed to protect the patient and others from the consequences of manic behavior. Melancholia was mania's opposite, a state of profound sadness and hopelessness that paralyzed the patient's will and made life seem unbearable. A melancholic patient moved slowly, spoke quietly if they spoke at all, showed no interest in food or activity or human company. They believed themselves worthless, guilty of terrible sins real or imagined, deserving of punishment. They spoke of death constantly, wished for it, sometimes actively sought it. Melancholia was particularly dangerous because of the risk of suicide, and melancholic patients were watched closely, kept in wards where sharp objects and cords and anything that could be used for self-harm were strictly controlled. The causes of melancholia were mysterious to Victorian physicians. Some cases seemed to follow obvious triggers: the death of a loved one, the loss of a fortune, a personal failure or disgrace. But other cases appeared without any precipitating event, the melancholia descending like a fog for no reason the patient or their family could identify. Women were thought to be particularly susceptible to melancholia, especially in connection with reproductive events. Puerperal melancholia followed childbirth, a state of despair and confusion that could last weeks or months. The change of life, menopause, was also thought to trigger melancholic episodes in middle-aged women. The asylum case notes were full of women admitted for melancholia related to these supposedly female vulnerabilities. Treatment for melancholia was less clear than for mania. the physicians tried various approaches, attempting to rouse the patient's interest through occupation, through changes of scenery, through moral encouragement. But melancholic patients were often too sunk in despair to respond to these gentle interventions. Opiates were sometimes used, not to sedate but to lift mood, though their effectiveness was limited and the risk of addiction high. Some physicians advocated for the opposite approach, using purgatives and emetics to purge the supposed toxins that caused melancholia, though this treatment often made patients feel physically worse without improving their mental state. Many melancholic patients simply had to endure, waiting for the episode to lift on its own, which it sometimes did after months or years, though just as often it did not. Monomania was a category that fascinated Victorian physicians. It described patients who were insane on one subject but rational on all others, whose delusion was narrow and specific. A patient might believe they were being persecuted by a particular person or organisation, but otherwise speak and behave normally. They might be convinced they had committed an unforgivable sin, or that they were suffering from a disease that medical examination could not detect, or that their food was being poisoned. The monomania could be benign or dangerous depending on its content. A patient who believed they were royalty but harmed no one was merely eccentric. A patient who believed their spouse was trying to murder them might act on that belief with violence. The concept of monomania created difficulties for the legal system because it raised questions about responsibility and capacity. If a person was insane only on one subject, could they be held accountable for crimes committed in connection with that delusion? The famous case of Daniel Macnaghten, who in 1843 killed the Prime Minister's secretary believing it was the Prime Minister himself, results in the Macnaghten Rules, legal standards for determining criminal insanity. But in the Asylum, the category of monomania was used more broadly, applied to any patient whose delusions were focused rather than diffuse. Treatment was problematic because logical argument did not dislodge the delusion, and yet the patient's rationality on other subjects suggested they might be reasoned with. Many monomaniac patients spent years in asylums, their delusions unchanging, their prospects for discharge nil. General paralysis of the insane was a category with a specific organic cause, though the Victorians did not understand this at first. It was a progressive disorder that began with changes in personality and judgment, progressed to delusions of grandeur and physical symptoms including tremors and difficulty speaking, and ended in complete mental and physical breakdown and death. The disease was common in Victorian asylums, accounting for a significant proportion of male admissions especially. Patients with general paralysis were typically admitted in their 30s or 40s, often successful men whose behaviour had become erratic and whose business or professional judgment had failed catastrophically. They believed themselves immensely wealthy or powerful, made absurd claims about their achievements, and seemed unable to recognise how ill they were. The physical symptoms distinguished general paralysis from other forms of insanity. The tremor of the hands, the slurred speech, the unsteady gait, the pupils that did not react normally to light. As the disease progressed, patients lost the ability to control their bodies, became incontinent, bedridden, helpless. Death usually came within 2 or 3 years of admission, from seizures or infections or simple physical collapse. The asylum could do nothing for these patients except provide basic care until the end. In the early 20th century, it was finally understood that general paralysis was caused by syphilis, the spirochete invading the brain years after the initial infection. But in the Victorian period, the disease was a medical mystery, tragic to witness and impossible to treat. Moral insanity was perhaps the most controversial of the Victorian diagnostic categories. It described patients who showed no signs of delusion or intellectual impairment, but whose behaviour violated moral and social norms in ways that seemed inexplicable. A person who lied constantly, stole without need, harmed others without remorse, who could not conform to the expectations of decent society despite understanding those expectations. The concept of moral insanity suggested that morality itself was a faculty of the mind that could be diseased, that a person could be insane in their character rather than in their thoughts. The category was used broadly and often problematically, Women who engaged in sexual behaviour outside marriage were sometimes diagnosed with moral insanity. Men who drank excessively or gambled away their family's money might be so labelled. Children and adolescents who were persistently disobedient or cruel could be committed to asylums under this diagnosis. The category gave physicians enormous power to define the boundaries of acceptable behaviour, to medicalise moral judgment. Critics, even in the Victorian period, argued that moral insanity was not a medical condition at all, but simply a label applied to people whose behaviour society wished to control. Idiocy and imbecility were categories for what would now be called intellectual disability, conditions present from birth or early childhood, rather than acquired through illness. The asylum housed many such patients, children and adults, who could not care for themselves and whose families either could not or would not keep them at home. The distinction between idiot and imbecile was based on degree of impairment, idiots being the more severely affected, unable to speak or perform basic self-care, while imbeciles had some limited capacity for simple work and communication. These patients were not insane in the sense of having suffered a breakdown, and the asylum was not an appropriate place for them. But Victorian society had few alternatives. There were specialised institutions for idiots and imbeciles, but they had limited capacity and often charged fees that poor families could not afford. So the patients ended up in asylums, housed in wards with the chronically insane, receiving no education or training that might develop what capacities they had. They simply existed there year after year, aging in institutions that were never designed for them. Epilepsy was often classified with insanity in Victorian medicine, though epileptics were not necessarily mad. The seizures themselves frightened people, and the belief persisted that epilepsy was connected to mental degeneration, that epileptics would eventually become insane if they were not already. Many asylums had separate epileptic wards, housing patients whose primary condition was seizures. The care provided was minimal, mostly a matter of preventing injury during seizures and administering bromides, which did reduce seizure frequency but had significant side effects. The physicians who created these categories believed they were doing scientific work, that they were bringing order and understanding to the chaos of mental illness. They published case studies in medical journals, comparing their observations with those of colleagues in other asylums, debating fine points of classification. At conferences of the Medico-Psychological Association, they presented papers on the distinguishing features of different types of insanity, the physical signs that might predict outcome, the hereditary patterns that seem to appear in some families but not others. But the categories were built on sand. They described symptoms but not causes. They grouped patients by superficial similarities without understanding the underlying mechanisms of their disorders. Two patients might both be diagnosed with melancholia and yet have completely different experiences, different triggers, different prospects for recovery. The categories were useful for organising the asylum's paperwork, for filling in the diagnosis column in admission registers, for reporting statistics to the commissioners. But they did not lead to effective treatments, and they did not significantly improve the lives of the patients who were classified. The asylum case notes recorded these diagnoses with clinical precision. Admitted July 12, 1875, diagnosis mania, supposed cause overwork. Admitted March 3, 1882, diagnosis melancholia, supposed cause domestic trouble. Admitted November 18, 1888, diagnosis general paralysis of the insane, supposed cause unknown. The diagnoses were written in neat medical handwriting, filed away in cabinets, occasionally reviewed when a patient's condition changed, or when the commissioners visited and asked to see records. But the diagnoses did not change the daily reality of the wards, did not alter the fact that most patients, whatever their classification, would spend years or decades in the asylum with little hope of cure. The light in the medical officers' rooms was better than in the wards, brighter and cleaner, with large windows and desks where the physicians wrote their notes and studied their textbooks. The categories of madness were written there, in quiet professional spaces, far from the noise and smell of the wards where the actual mad lived and suffered. The categories brought comfort to the physicians, the illusion of understanding, the sense that they were practicing scientific medicine. But down in the wards, the attendants who actually spent their days with the patients knew better. They knew that the categories meant little. The madness was too varied and too human to fit neatly into diagnostic boxes, that the only real difference between patients was whether they were quiet or noisy, clean or dirty, whether they could work or could not, whether they would ever leave or would die there. The categories were for the paperwork. The reality was something else entirely. Chapter 8. The Incurable Wards. At the far end of the asylum, in corridors that received less traffic and less light, were the wards for chronic patients. These were the incurable wards, places where hope had been abandoned by the institution, if not always by the patients themselves. The architecture here was the same as elsewhere in the asylum. The same long corridors and high ceilings and narrow windows, but the atmosphere was different. Quieter in some ways, more disturbed in others. The chronic wards housed those who'd been in the asylum for decades, who would die there, whose names appeared year after year in the annual reports in the column marked chronic rather than acute or convalescent. These were the patients the moral treatment philosophy had failed, or perhaps had never truly tried to help, the inconvenient truth at the heart of the Victorian asylum system. The chronic male ward on the ground floor of the West Wing held 60 patients in a space designed for the 40. The beds were closer together than in other wards, iron frames almost touching, because chronic patients were not expected to have possessions or privacy, were not working toward recovery that might require personal space. The men who lived here ranged in age from 30 to 80, though most were middle-aged or older. Some had been admitted as young men and had simply never left, growing old within these walls, their lives measured not in achievements or relationships, but in the passage of asylum seasons, the endless repetition of institutional routine. Many of the chronic patients were physically deteriorated as well as mentally disturbed. Years of institutional life, of poor diet and little exercise beyond pacing the airing courts, had left them weak and unhealthy. They shuffled rather than walked, their backs bent, their muscles atrophied from disuse. Their teeth were bad or missing entirely, because the asylum provided minimal dental care and extractions were easier than treatment. Their skin was pale from lack of sunlight, their bodies marked by old scars from falls or fights or self-inflicted wounds that had healed without proper medical attention. They looked older than their years, worn down by time and neglect and the simple grinding misery of chronic institutionalization. The day in the chronic wards was even more monotonous than in the acute wards. There was no work for most of these patients, no expectation that they would participate in the asylum's labour system. They were considered too damaged, too unreliable, too slow. So they sat in the day room, dozens of men on wooden benches arranged along the walls, or they paced, walking the length of the room over and over, wearing grooves in the floorboards with their endless circuits. Some talked to themselves, carrying on conversations with voices only they could hear. Some sang fragments of songs, the same verses repeated until they lost all meaning. Some simply stared, their eyes fixed on nothing, their minds elsewhere or nowhere. The attendants assigned to the chronic wards were often the least experienced or the least capable, the ones who could not manage the more demanding acute wards, or who had been relegated here as a form of demotion. There was little for them to do beyond basic supervision. They unlocked the doors in the morning and locked them at night. They marched patients to meals and back. They broke up fights when they occurred, which was rare because chronic patients generally lacked the energy for violence. They cleaned up when patients soiled themselves, which happened often, especially among the older patients who had lost continence. The work required little skill and offered no satisfaction, and the attendants who did it were usually those who had given up caring, who went through the motions for a wage and nothing more. The female chronic ward was on the second floor of the East Wing, a mirror image of the male ward in layout, but different in atmosphere. There were more women than men in the chronic wards, reflecting the greater numbers of women admitted to asylums overall, and the greater likelihood that women would be committed for conditions that in men might have been tolerated as eccentricity. The women here were old before their time, their hair grey or white, though many were only in their 40s or 50s, their faces lined with the particular exhaustion that came from years of institutional life. They wore the same shapeless brown dresses, the same heavy boots, and many had stopped caring about their appearance entirely, had ceased to perform the rituals of grooming that Victorian women were taught from childhood. Some of the women in the chronic ward had been there since they were young, admitted for puerperal insanity after childbirth and never recovering, admitted for melancholia following a disappointment or a loss and sinking into a state from which they never emerged, admitted for behaviours that had alarmed their families, religious mania or sexual impropriety or simply being difficult, and kept there because their families never came back for them. The asylum became their world, the only world they knew, and after enough years, it was hard to imagine they could have functioned anywhere else. They had been institutionalized in the deepest sense, shaped by the asylum into people who could only exist within its structures. There were patients in the chronic wards who had not spoken in years. Mute by choice or by the progression of their illness, they moved through the days in silence, their inner lives completely inaccessible. The attendants sometimes forgot they could speak, treated them as if they were deaf as well as mute, talked about them in their presence as if they were furniture. These silent patients watched everything, their eyes following the attendants, tracking the movements of other patients, observing the routines with an attention that suggested awareness, even if they gave no other sign of it. What they thought, what they felt, remained locked inside them. The asylum made no effort to reach them. They were fed and housed, and that was considered sufficient. Other chronic patients talked constantly, compulsively, their speech a stream of words that made no obvious sense. They spoke to anyone and no one, narrating their delusions, repeating phrases and names, asking questions that they answered themselves. The content of their speech was often religious. Victorian Christianity filtering through disordered minds to produce elaborate theological delusions. They were prophets or angels or demons. They had messages from God or warnings about the end times. They had committed the unforgivable sins and were damned for eternity. The attendants learned to ignore this constant talk, to tune it out the way one might tune out the sound of rain or wind, but for new patients in the chronic wards, the ones still adjusting to their confinement, the constant babble of the chronically insane was one of the hardest things to endure. The asylum provided minimal medical care to chronic patients. The physicians made their rounds but spent little time in these wards. There was nothing to treat, no interventions that would make a difference. The patients were simply maintained, kept alive and housed until they died. When they fell ill with physical ailments, they might be moved to the asylum infirmary if their condition was acute, but often they were left in the chronic ward to recover or not as their bodies decided. The asylum's resources were finite, and chronic patients were a low priority. They had already consumed years of institutional care. If they died, it freed up a bed for a new patient who might have better prospects. Death was common in the chronic wards. The patients were old or prematurely aged, their health compromised by years of poor diet and institutional neglect. They died of pneumonia and influenza and tuberculosis, of strokes and heart failures, of infections that spread through the crowded dormitories and could not be contained. When a patient died, the attendants stripped the bed and cleaned it, and within a day or two a new patient would be sleeping there. Their body was taken to the asylum mortuary, a small building, on the grounds where corpses were stored until they could be buried or, if family claimed them, released for private burial. Most chronic patients were buried in the asylum cemetery, in graves marked with numbers rather than names, their existence recorded only in the asylum's death register. Some chronic patients had been in the asylum so long that their families had forgotten them or died themselves. There was no one on the outside who remembered they existed, no one who would visit or write or eventually claim their body for burial. These patients were completely alone in the world, their only relationships those with other patients and with attendants who changed every few years. The asylum was their family, the only community they had, and it was a cold and indifferent family that provided shelter and food, but nothing resembling affection or belonging. The asylum's annual reports acknowledged the chronic wards but did not dwell on them. The statistics were recorded, the number of chronic patients, the death rate in the chronic wards, the average length of stay, but the reports focused on the acute cases, on admissions and discharges, on the patients who recovered, or at least improved enough to leave. The chronic patients were an embarrassment, evidence that the asylum was not primarily a hospital but a warehouse, a place where people were stored because society had no other use for them. The physicians who wrote the reports knew this, but they framed it differently, spoke of the unfortunate cases where hereditary degeneration or organic brain disease made recovery impossible, where the asylum's role was to provide humane custody rather than cure. The chronic wards were where the promises of moral treatment were most obviously broken. There was no occupation here, no gentle encouragement, no structured environment designed to restore reason. There was only custody, the bare minimum required to keep patients alive and confined. The wards were clean enough to pass inspection, the patients were fed enough to survive, the dormitories were locked at night. Beyond that, nothing. The patients woke and sat and ate and slept day after day, in a routine so predictable that weeks blurred into months and months into years without distinction. Some chronic patients had lost all sense of time. They could not say how long they had been in the asylum, could not remember what year it was or how old they were. The external markers that structured time in the outside world, birthdays and holidays and seasons of work and rest, had been replaced by the uniform rhythm of institutional life. Christmas was marked by a slightly better meal, and perhaps a carol service in the chapel, but otherwise it was just another day. Their own birthdays passed unnoticed except in the medical records, where age was updated annually for statistical purposes. Time in the chronic ward was not linear, moving toward anything but circular, an endless loop of identical days. Yet even in the chronic wards, there were moments of humanity, small instances of connection between patients that the institution did not plan or control. Two patients who had been there for decades might develop a friendship of sorts, sitting together in the day room, sharing the occasional piece of hoarded food, offering what comfort they could in a place that offered none. A patient might take on the role of caretaker for another, who was more impaired, helping them eat or guiding them when they became confused. These relationships were fragile and often invisible to the staff, but they existed, evidence that the human capacity for connection persisted even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The chronic ward patients watched the seasons change through the high windows, saw the light shift from summer brightness to winter grey and back again. They watched new patients arrive and sometimes, rarely, watched old patients leave, discharged or transferred or taken away in coffins. They watched attendants come and go, some staying for years, others disappearing after a few weeks. They watched the asylum's routines continue with mechanical precision, the bells ringing at the same times, the meals arriving like clockwork, the doors locking and unlocking in their appointed sequence. They were observers of their own slow dissolution, witnesses to the institution's endless functioning. In the asylum's account books, the chronic patients were the most expensive category, not because they received more care, but because they stayed longer. A patient who was admitted and discharged within a year cost the asylum less than a patient who remained for 40 years, even though the daily cost per patient was higher for acute cases. The commissioners who reviewed the asylum's finances understood this, and there was periodic pressure on asylum superintendents to find ways to discharge chronic patients, or at least to reduce the rate at which they accumulated. But there was nowhere for chronic patients to go. Their families would not take them back. The workhouses did not want them. Private asylums would not accept them without payment that their families could not or would not provide. So they remained. The population of chronic patients growing steadily, occupying an increasing proportion of the asylum's beds. The chronic wards were the asylum's permanent population, the layer that persisted beneath the flow of acute admissions and discharges. They were the foundation on which the institution rested, the evidence of what the asylum truly was beneath its rhetoric of treatment and cure. They were the forgotten, the given up on, the warehoused. and they would remain in those wards, in those beds, in those day rooms, until death finally released them from the only home they had known for most of their adult lives. The asylum would record their deaths, bury them in numbered graves, clear their beds for the next patient, and continue its work unchanged. The chronic wards would remain full because there was always another patient to take the place of one who died. Always another person that society did not know what to do with, another mind that had broken in ways the Victorian world could not repair. The light in the chronic wards was dim, filtering through windows that were rarely cleaned, and in that dim light time moved slowly, slower than anywhere else in the asylum, so slowly that it almost seemed to stop, leaving the patient suspended in an endless present from which there was no escape but death. Chapter 9. The Scandals. The first cracks in the asylum system's facade appeared in the pages of newspapers. In 1858, a series of articles in the Times of London detailed conditions at the Middlesex County Asylum at Hanwell, one of the largest and supposedly best-managed institutions in England. The reports described overcrowding so severe that patients slept two to a bed or on mattresses on the floors. They described inadequate staffing, with single attendants responsible for supervising 50 or 60 patients at a time. They described patients left in restraints for days without medical justification, mechanical restraint being used not as treatment but as convenience, a way to manage a population too large for the available staff. The revelations shocked respectable Victorian society, which had believed the asylum system represented enlightened progress in the treatment of the insane. The articles prompted an investigation by the Commissioners in Lunacy, the government body responsible for overseeing asylums. The commissioners visited Hanwell, inspected the wards, interviewed staff and patients. Their report confirmed many of the newspaper's allegations. The asylum was overcrowded, holding nearly 2,000 patients in a facility designed for half that number. Restraint was being used excessively. Medical supervision was inadequate. The commissioners recommended reforms, but they also noted that the problems at Hanwell were not unique, that similar conditions existed in county asylums across England. The system had grown too quickly, admitting patients faster than it could properly care for them, and the result was institutions that could barely maintain basic standards of safety and hygiene, much less provide the therapeutic environment moral treatment required. But the reforms that followed were limited. The commissioners had no power to close asylums or remove superintendents. They could only report problems and recommend changes, and their recommendations were often ignored or implemented slowly. The fundamental issues, the overcrowding and understaffing, persisted because they were built into the system itself. The law required counties to provide asylum care for pauper lunatics, but it did not provide adequate funding. The asylums admitted everyone who was certified, but they could not expand their staff proportionally because the counties would not pay for it. The result was a chronic crisis, with asylums perpetually too full and perpetually short of staff, and scandals that erupted periodically when conditions became so bad that they could no longer be hidden. In the 1870s, another type of scandal emerged, one that focused not on conditions but on wrongful confinement. A series of cases involving women committed by their husbands attracted public attention and raised disturbing questions about how easily the certification process could be abused. The case of Louisa Lowe was particularly notorious. In 1870, her husband had her certified and committed to a private asylum after she refused to leave a religious community she had joined. Lowe was not insane by any reasonable medical standard, but two physicians had been found who were willing to sign certificates based on the husband's testimony that she was behaving irrationally. She was held in the asylum for 18 months before supporters outside managed to secure her release. Afterward, she campaigned for reform of the lunacy laws, publishing pamphlets and testifying before parliamentary committees, arguing that the certification process gave too much power to husbands and family members and too little protection to those being committed. The most famous case of alleged wrongful confinement was that of Georgina Weldon. In 1878, her husband attempted to have her certified and committed after she had embarrassed him by speaking publicly about their marital difficulties. He arranged for 2 physicians to come to their home to examine her, but Weldon learned of the plan and escaped before they arrived. She fled to France, then returned to England and launched a lengthy legal battle, suing the physicians who had signed the certificates without actually examining her, suing her husband, and ultimately becoming a prominent advocate for reform. Her case revealed how easily the system could be manipulated, how 2 medical signatures could be obtained based on hearsay and spite, rather than genuine examination of the patient's mental show. These cases led to the Lunacy Act of 1890, which attempted to strengthen protections against wrongful confinement. The new law required that patients be examined separately by 2 physicians, neither of whom could have a financial interest in the asylum where the patient would be confined. It gave patients the right to request discharge after 6 months and required magistrates to visit asylums regularly and interview patients who wished to speak with them. But the reforms were limited in practice. Most patients were still paupers who lacked the educational resources to navigate the legal system. The physicians who certified them were still paid fees for each certification. The asylum superintendent still had nearly absolute authority over who was released and when. The law made wrongful confinement slightly harder, but it did not eliminate the problem. The scandals of abuse and neglect continued through the late Victorian period. In 1895, an investigation at the Lancaster County Asylum revealed systematic cruelty by attendants, including beating patients, withholding food as punishment, and subjecting patients to unnecessary cold baths and restraints. Several attendants were dismissed, but the superintendent, who should have been aware of what was happening in his institution, faced no consequences beyond a reprimand. The investigation found that the asylum was understaffed, and that the attendants who committed the abuses had been working impossibly long shifts with minimal supervision. The commissioners recommended hiring more staff, but the county declined, citing budget constraints. In 1903, a scandal at the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum involved the death of a patient who had been left in a padded cell without food or water for 3 days. The patient had been violent and was placed in seclusion, but the attendant who was supposed to check on him regularly had failed to do so, and the patient had died of dehydration. An inquest returned a verdict of death by neglect, and the attendant was prosecuted. But the broader question, why one attendant had been responsible for checking on dozens of patients in seclusion and refractory wards with no oversight, was not seriously addressed. The system required levels of vigilance and care that the staffing ratios made impossible, and when something went wrong, individual attendants were blamed while the institutional failures continued. Some scandals came from inside the system, from physicians and attendants who could no longer remain silent about what they witnessed. In 1908, Dr. Montague Lomax, who had worked in several asylums, published a book called The Experiences of an Asylum Doctor, which detailed the conditions he had seen. He described wards where patients lived in filth because there were not enough attendants to keep them clean. He described the routine use of restraints and sedatives to manage patients who should have been receiving therapeutic care. He described the chronic wards where patients were left to vegetate for decades with no medical attention beyond basic physical maintenance. His book caused a brief outcry and led to another round of investigations and recommendations for reform, but the fundamental problems persisted. There were also scandals that never made the newspapers, instances of abuse and neglect that were handled quietly within the asylum system or simply ignored. A patient beaten by an attendant and left with broken ribs, the injury attributed to a fall in the medical records. A female patient sexually assaulted by a male staff member, the complaint dismissed as a delusion. Patients who died from neglect or from treatments administered carelessly, their deaths recorded as due to natural causes or to the progression of their mental illness, rather than to institutional failure. These incidents happened in asylums across the country, but they rarely came to public attention because the patients involved had no advocates, no families who cared enough to investigate, no ability to make their complaints heard beyond the asylum walls. some journalists took it upon themselves to investigate asylum conditions from the inside. Nellie Bly, an American journalist, had herself committed to an asylum in New York in 1887 and wrote about the experience in a series of articles that exposed neglect and abuse. Her methods were controversial, but her reporting was detailed and credible, and it sparked reforms in the American asylum system. In England, similar undercover investigations were conducted, though less frequently. The journalists who did this work risked their own safety and sanity, spending days or weeks living as patients in institutions that offered little protection and less mercy. Their accounts confirmed what reformers had been saying for decades, that the asylum system had failed to live up to its promise, that moral treatment had been replaced by custodial warehousing, and that many patients would have been better served by almost any alternative arrangement. The asylum establishment responded to scandals defensively. The Medico-Psychological Association published articles arguing that conditions in asylums were better than critics claimed, that the occasional instances of abuse were aberrations rather than systemic problems, that the physicians and staff were doing the best they could under difficult circumstances, and there was some truth in this defence. Many asylum staff were conscientious and worked in good faith within a system that set them up to fail. The overcrowding was not their fault. The inadequate funding was not their choice. The laws that required them to admit every certified patient regardless of whether they could be properly cared for were imposed from outside. But the defensiveness also served to protect the system from serious scrutiny, to deflect criticism, and avoid fundamental changes that might have improved conditions. The scandals revealed a gap between the asylum system's rhetoric and its reality. The official story told in annual reports and medical journals was that asylums were hospitals where the insane received scientific treatment and many recovered. The reality revealed in scandals and investigations and the testimony of former patients was that asylums were primarily custodial institutions where the insane were warehoused, often in poor conditions with little expectation of recovery. Both versions were true in a sense. Some patients did receive good care and were discharged recovered, but the majority did not, and the system's failures were more characteristic of its nature than its successes. Public opinion about asylums remained divided. On one hand, there was recognition that the system had serious problems and that reforms were needed. On the other hand, there was also a sense that asylums were necessary, that society needed somewhere to put people who were mad or difficult or troublesome, and that the asylum system, for all its flaws, served this function. The scandals prompted periodic efforts at reform, but they did not fundamentally challenge the existence of the system itself. Asylums continued to be built, continued to admit patients, continued to function as they had, with incremental improvements here and there, but no transformation of their basic nature. The patients whose cases became public scandals were unusual, exceptional in some way that made their stories newsworthy. They were women of good families wrongly committed, patients who died in circumstances dramatic enough to warrant inquests, victims of abuse so egregious that even Victorian tolerance for institutional authority was breached. But for every patient whose story became public, there were hundreds whose suffering remained invisible, whose years in asylums were endured without witness, whose deaths were recorded in asylum registers and nowhere else. The scandals illuminated corners of the asylum system, but large areas remained in shadow, unexamined and unchanged. The reformers who emerged from these scandals, former patients like Louisa Lowe and Georgina Weldon, advocacy groups like the alleged Lunatics Friend Society, achieved some limited victories. The law was strengthened slightly. Inspections became more regular. Patients' rights to petition for release were clarified. But the asylum system proved remarkably resistant to fundamental change. It was too large, too entrenched, too necessary to Victorian society's sense of order. The scandals would continue, periodically erupting in newspapers and prompting investigations throughout the rest of the Victorian period and into the 20th century, and the asylums would continue as well, adapting enough to survive criticism but never transforming into the therapeutic institutions their founders had imagined. The light that the scandals cast on the asylum system was harsh but brief. The public's attention moved on to other concerns. The institutions remained, their high walls and narrow windows still standing, still housing thousands who had no other place to go. The machinery of admission and custody continued to turn indifferent to scandal, sustained by law and custom, and the simple fact that Victorian society required somewhere to put its inconvenient mad. The reforms were real but insufficient. The abuses continued in quieter forms, and the asylum endured, a permanent feature of the landscape, its shadow long across the lives of all who entered its gates. Chapter 10. The Shadows That Remain. The decline of the Victorian asylum was gradual, a process that unfolded over decades rather than years. The system that had expanded so rapidly in the mid-19th century, that had built vast institutions across the English countryside, began to contract in the early 20th century, not because it was replaced with something better, but because it could no longer be sustained. The asylums had become too large, too extensive, too obviously failing at their stated purpose. The promise of cure had long since been abandoned by everyone except the most optimistic physicians, and even they had to acknowledge that the majority of patients admitted would never be discharged. The asylum had become what its critics had always said it was, a place of permanent confinement rather than temporary treatment, a warehouse for the unwanted rather than a hospital for the sick. The First World War disrupted the asylum system in ways that would have lasting effects. Many asylum attendants and junior medical staff enlisted or were conscripted, leaving the institutions even more understaffed than usual. Some asylums were partially commandeered for military use, converted into hospitals for wounded soldiers or for soldiers suffering from shell shock. The patients already in residence were crowded into fewer wards to make space, and the care they received declined further. Food became scarcer as wartime rationing affected asylum supplies. Patients went hungry, and the death rate in asylums increased dramatically during the war years, from malnutrition and from diseases like tuberculosis that spread more easily in overcrowded and under-resourced conditions. After the war, the asylum system never fully recovered. The Mental Treatment Act of 1930 began to shift the focus toward voluntary treatment and outpatient care, acknowledging that institutional confinement was not always necessary or beneficial. The Act allowed patients to seek treatment voluntarily without being certified, a recognition that the stigma and coercion of certification had prevented many people from seeking help until their conditions had become severe. It also encouraged the development of outpatient clinics and temporary observation wards in general hospitals, alternatives to the massive county asylums that had dominated Victorian psychiatry. But the asylums themselves persisted. They were too large to simply close, housing populations of thousands who had nowhere else to go. The chronic patients who had been institutionalized for decades could not be released into communities that had no services to support them and families who no longer remembered them. The buildings continued to function, though with declining resources and declining prestige. Asylum medicine was no longer a respected field. Young physicians chose other specialties, and the asylums were left with aging staff and outdated methods. The institutions became backwaters, places where careers stalled rather than flourished, where the work was repetitive and unrewarding, and the prospects for advancement were minimal. The Second World War dealt another blow to the asylum system. Again, staff were called away to military service, and again, resources were diverted to the war effort. The death rate in asylums spiked even higher than it had during the First World War. Thousands of patients died from starvation and neglect, not because of deliberate cruelty, but because the institution simply could not function adequately under wartime conditions. After the war, investigations into asylum deaths during the period revealed the extent of the failure, and public confidence in the system, already low, declined further. The development of new psychiatric medications in the 1950s and 60s began to make institutional confinement seem less necessary. Chlorpromazine and other antipsychotic drugs could control some symptoms of serious mental illness, making it possible for patients to live outside institutions with medication management. The drugs were not cures, and they had significant side effects, but they offered an alternative to permanent confinement that had not existed before. The policy of deinstitutionalization began in the 1960s, a movement to discharge long-term asylum patients and close the Victorian institutions that had housed them. But deinstitutionalization was implemented poorly, with insufficient planning and inadequate community services to support the patients who were released. Many former asylum patients ended up homeless or in prisons or cycling through emergency psychiatric services, no better off and sometimes worse off than they had been in the institutions. The asylums had been terrible places in many ways, but they had at least provided shelter and basic care. The community services that were supposed to replace them often failed to materialize or were chronically underfunded. The closure of the asylums was presented as a liberation, and for some patients it was, but for others it was simply a different form of abandonment. The physical buildings of the Victorian asylums began to close in the 1980s and 1990s. The massive institutions that had defined the landscape of psychiatric care for more than a century were emptied and boarded up. Some were demolished, their distinctive Gothic facades torn down and the land redeveloped. Others were converted to new uses, transformed into apartment complexes, or business parks or university buildings. A few were preserved as historical sites or museums, places where the public could visit and learn about the history of psychiatric care, though these preserved sites often sanitized that history, focusing on the architecture and the theoretical ideals of moral treatment, while downplaying the reality of what patients actually experienced. The records of the Victorian asylums, the admission registers and case notes and discharge books were archived in county record offices and libraries. These documents provide a detailed picture of who was admitted, for what reasons, and what happened to them, though the picture is necessarily incomplete and filtered through the perspectives of the physicians and staff who created the records. Historians and genealogists study these archives, tracing family members who disappeared into asylums, reconstructing the lives of people who left few other traces in the historical record. The records reveal patterns: the gendered nature of diagnosis, the use of asylums to control deviant behaviour, the high mortality rates and low discharge rates that characterise the system. Some former asylum sites have become notorious, associated with stories of hauntings and paranormal activity. Urban explorers break into abandoned asylum buildings, photographing the decay, the peeling paint and broken windows and empty wards where patients once lived. These images circulate online, feeding a fascination with the aesthetic of institutional abandonment and with the darker aspects of psychiatric history. The asylums have become symbols of a barbaric past, places where unspeakable things happened, though this symbolism sometimes obscures the more complex and mundane reality of what the institutions actually were. The legacy of the Victorian asylum is visible in contemporary attitudes toward mental illness and psychiatric treatment. The stigma attached to mental illness, the fear of institutionalization, the distrust of psychiatric authority, all have roots in the asylum era. The language of that period persists as well, terms like asylum and lunatic that are now considered offensive, but that shaped how mental illness was understood for generations. The debates that surrounded the Victorian asylum about the balance between liberty and treatment, about who should have the authority to confine someone against their will, about the adequacy of community versus institutional care, continue in different forms today. The patients who lived and died in Victorian asylums are largely forgotten as individuals. Their names appear in archives but rarely anywhere else. They have no monuments, no memorials, except in a few cases where former patients achieved enough fame or notoriety that their asylum experiences became part of their public stories. The majority passed through the system anonymously, their lives reduced to entries in admission registers, their deaths recorded in asylum burial records, their graves marked with numbers if marked at all. They were working class men and women mostly, people without power or resources, people whose families or communities had decided they could not be accommodated in ordinary life and had to be removed. Some of those patients were genuinely ill, suffering from conditions that even today would require intensive treatment and support. Others were victims of a system that medicalized social problems, that labeled as insane people who were poor or difficult or simply different. Both groups endured the same institutional regime, the same loss of liberty and dignity, the same grinding routine of asylum life. The system did not distinguish between those who needed medical treatment and those who needed something else entirely, social support or economic assistance or simply tolerance for their differences. Everyone who was certified went to the same place, was subjected to the same methods, and faced the same odds of ever leaving. The Victorian Asylum represented an attempt to address the problem of mental illness through institutional means, to create ordered environments where disordered minds could be studied and treated, and hopefully cured. The attempt failed, or succeeded only partially, and at tremendous human cost. The institutions became ends in themselves rather than means to treatment, self-perpetuating systems that continued to admit patients long after it was clear that most would never benefit from confinement. The staff who worked in these institutions were participants in this system, some trying to do good within its constraints, others simply indifferent or actively cruel, but all shaped by an institutional culture that valued order and control over genuine care. The reformers who campaigned against asylum abuses, who exposed scandals and advocated for patients' rights, achieved some victories but never transformed the system fundamentally. The asylums were too embedded in Victorian society, too necessary to its functioning, too supported by the law and medical authority. The reforms that were implemented were incremental, improving conditions at the margins but leaving the basic structure intact. It took the development of new medications and new ideas about psychiatric care, combined with economic pressures that made maintaining large institutions unsustainable to finally end the asylum era. But the end of the Victorian asylum did not mean the end of the problems it had attempted to address. People still experience severe mental illness. Families still struggle to care for relatives whose behaviour is disturbed or dangerous. Society still grapples with questions about when and how to intervene, when confinement is justified, and when it is a violation of liberty. The solutions have changed, the settings have changed, but the fundamental tensions remain. The Victorian asylum was one answer to these questions, an answer that proved deeply flawed, but that was implemented with confidence and sustained for more than a century. Understanding what the asylum was, how it functioned, what it did to the people who lived inside it, remains important not just as history, but as a warning about what can happen when institutions designed to help instead become mechanisms of control and confinement. The buildings still stand in some places, converted to new uses, but recognisable by their architecture, by the long corridors and high windows that once defined asylum design. The cemeteries where asylum patients were buried remain, many of them neglected, the numbered markers weathered and illegible. The records remain in archives, testimony to thousands of individual lives that intersected with the asylum system and were shaped by it. And the memory remains, cultural memory of the asylum as a place of horror and hopelessness, a memory that may be exaggerated in some particulars, but that captures an essential truth about what these institutions became. The Victorian asylum promised treatment and delivered custody. It promised cure and delivered chronic confinement. It promised enlightened scientific care and often delivered neglect or abuse. The gap between promise and reality was the defining characteristic of the system, and it persisted from the opening of the first county asylums in the 1840s until the closure of the last institutions more than a century later. The patients who experienced that gap, who lived their lives in the space between what the asylum claimed to be and what it actually was, paid the price with their liberty, their dignity, and often their lives. Night has fallen now across the landscapes where the Victorian asylums once stood. The windows are dark where once there were gas lamps burning in the wards. The corridors are silent where once there were footsteps and voices, and the jangle of attendants' keys. The dormitories are empty where once there were rows of iron beds, each with its patient, each patient with their story of how they came to this place and why they never left. The asylum era has ended, but its shadows remain, stretching long across the history of psychiatric care, across our understanding of mental illness and institutional power, across the lives of all who passed through those high walls and narrow gates and into the world the asylum made, a world of order and routine and endless waiting where time moved slowly or not at all, where hope was scarce and release was rare, where thousands lived and died largely forgotten by the world outside. The candle has burned low, the final page has turned, and the asylum, after all these years, finally falls silent in the dark.